Welcome to SkyeTeam's People First with Morag Barrett.
Welcome to this week's episode of People First. And my guest this week is the amazing global workplace expert, Roberta Matuson. And she is a 6-time author, the president of Matuson Consulting, a firm that helps organizations to attract, hire, and keep the best people. She's a LinkedIn top voice in management and workplace, a contributor to Forbes and Fast Company, and the author of the forthcoming Can We Talk? 7 Principles for Managing Difficult Conversations at Work, which we are going to be talking about today. She's one of the few people who has appeared on the O'Reilly Factor with Bill O'Reilly and left the show unscathed. So maybe another little talking point that we need to go through. So Roberta, welcome to People First.
Well, thank you. And thanks so much for having me.
Oh, I am so excited for these conversations because anybody who knows me is difficult conversations. Well, firstly, we'll get to the definition of difficult conversations, but I both excel and fail miserably, depending on whether I'm talking to my teenage sons or other adults, but we'll get to that point. But as ever, this episode and People First is all about the leadership journeys that we are all on. So if you were living your childhood dream, if we flash back to you in elementary school and the teacher said, Roberta, what do you want to be when you grow up? What would your answer have been then?
Oh, that's an easy question. I mean, I was going to be a famous actress.
Aha.
And it's kind of interesting because my dream did come true because I'm now, acting on LinkedIn Live. So I am starring in episodes. So, it's never too late to live your dream.
Well, that and the O'Reilly Factor. I mean, good grief, there should be a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame for you right now.
Well, please cast your votes.
Well, there you go. So the Oscar and the crowd goes wild. So what was the pivot point then that brought you to running your own firm and 6 books under your belt or your typewriter ribbon?
Well, as you get older and you get more experience, you realize that oftentimes you can contribute more if you are working in a different way. And so that's when I made the decision to leave the corporate world and step out of my role as head of HR and to have the opportunity to help more organizations.
Mm-hmm. So have you always had a passion for writing? I can see some of your other books there behind you, but 6 books, I know, having written, or I'm working on my 3rd right now, it's harder than birthing children sometimes. So have you always had a passion for the written word?
It's funny because I have to say, honestly, not. I tell people when I think back through my childhood, nobody ever said, oh my gosh, like you're such a great writer. No teachers ever said, oh, you're really good at this. So it was a complete surprise to me.
Yeah. Well, so your new book, it's out September 28th. And I know this episode we're planning to publish around that day. And it's called Can We Talk? The 7 Principles for Managing Difficult Conversations at Work. So let's just start there with, what is a difficult conversation? How do you define it?
Well, I think everybody has to define it differently, right? So, for example, I might not have an issue telling an employee that their job is really not up to par, whereas you might be a person who doesn't really care for confrontation. And so that makes that kind of conversation difficult for you. So it's really a conversation that you avoid because it's uncomfortable.
All right. So that would be a warning sign, I suppose, that we're entering. And I love the fact that you talked there about it being a personal definition, because as I said in my introduction, I know that sometimes when I'm talking with my teenage sons, they can push buttons in a way that accelerate the heat index of the conversation very quickly. But also at work, even though like you, I teach conflict management, I teach feedback skills. Personally, I'm always paying attention and learning and flexing because some conversations come easy when it's about the business and taking informed risk. But when it's interpersonal feedback that I'm giving, that's where I start to struggle.
Well, you're not alone, which is why I wrote the book.
Okay, so the book shares 7 principles. So give us some highlights of the research that you've done and the 7 principles that we're going to discover in the book.
Well, I'll tell you what 3 of them are. And then if you want to know what the rest are, you'll have to download the book.
Yes.
The first principle is really confidence, and that's really having the confidence to speak your truth. And all too often, people will approach us with a difficult conversation, and we're not confident, and so we don't push back. And so the way this book is written, it's not just for leaders who want to learn how to manage difficult conversations with their people. It's for employees who may need to have one of those conversations with a coworker or even their boss. And so to do that, you really need to have confidence, right? You can't go in there timid. Another key factor and principle in the book is clarity, because so often we go into these conversations and we have no idea, like, oh yeah, what was my point? But then we think we've done such a great job, and the other person leaves going, okay, what the heck was that? And you're like tapping your shoulder going, that was awesome.
Yes.
And then the third one that I'll reveal is courage.
Okay.
It really takes a lot of courage to say what's on your mind. And I think that's even more true for women than men. And that's just my experience. I do a lot of executive coaching, and a lot of my female clients are reticent to say what they need to say for fear of not being liked.
So I love the alliteration of that, the C's that go into these principles. So you talk confidence, clarity, and courage. And so tell me more about the courage. What is the fears that you hear most often from leaders and individuals that cause them to hesitate and hold back in these very important conversations?
Well, right now I'm hearing a lot, well, what if they quit? And I'm like, well, what if they don't quit? You're stuck with this person. So I think there's fear of that. I think there's fear of offending someone, but not really understanding that you're actually helping them if you're letting them know that there's a problem that they can solve. So there's fear of, telling my boss that they're wrong when they know that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff driven by fear and self-confidence and, lack of self-esteem.
Yeah, and you touch there the fear of upward feedback and tough conversations. It can be career limiting for me if I deliver a message upwards that lands inelegantly. But of course, it's career limiting for the leader who needs the warnings of impending disaster.
Exactly.
And so for me, when I'm coaching leaders, it's yes, let's understand the fear and what's causing you to hesitate and how much of that fear is imagined or real. And then irrespective of whether it's imagined or real, what can you do, to your point, then have the confidence and leverage the courage to have the conversation in spite of the risks?
Well, I always say, listen, no one's shooting at you. Okay. So that you're in a good place, right? You're not in the middle of a war zone. And then you have to look at the other side and say, well, what's going to happen if I don't have this conversation? And I think most people will agree that the longer you wait, the harder it gets.
Yeah, the mess just gets stinkier. So clarity, you taught there and you shared the example. And I think I've been at the receiving end and no doubt at the delivery end of the conversation that either I thought I was so clear and to the point, it ended up being a punch between the eyes, a metaphorical punch between the eyes to the person receiving it. So I went in too hard. But I also know that when I'm nervous and I haven't thought through what I want to say and communicate, I can talk around the houses and soft soap the message until it's somewhere lost in the proverbial feedback sandwich. So what are your tips then for clarity when we're delivering a message, whether it's a good news message or a tough message? How do we make sure that we're clear and precise?
Well, I have my clients actually write down, like, what is the objective of this conversation? And at the end of this conversation, what do I want this person to do or stop doing? And if I can define that, then I know what kind of conversation I'm going to have. And, in the book, I write about one of my clients who is the president of a hospital, and he was having what he thought was a very clear conversation with one of his senior executives, who walked away with a completely different picture of the expectation, and things went from bad to worse. And it got to a place where eventually he had no choice. They had to part ways. And to this day, he still feels pretty badly about it because he knows that had he been more clear, he probably could have retained this executive. But he in retrospect, he was like, I was saying this and he was hearing that. And I didn't go back to, confirm with him, like, okay, tell me what you just heard.
Well, you've just answered the question I was about to ask, which is how do you confirm that the message has been received as intended? Because again, I speak English, and I have learned that English and American English can be two different languages. And if we're not paying attention, there is an opportunity for those two parties in the conversation to leave. Look at my hand, you see the palm, I'm seeing the knuckles. You're still looking at the hand, however, not talking to the hand, of course. But it's two different perspectives that maybe not align. So how do we go back and close that loop?
Well, again, asking clarifying questions like, tell me what you just heard. Tell me when you leave here today what you're going to do differently as a result of this conversation. Tell me, do you have a clear understanding of what will happen next if you're unable to fix this? And, if the person's like saying something and it's like, no, maybe I'm not clear here. Let me be clear. And going back and really, like you said, stop talking in circles and just say what needs to be said.
Mm-hmm. I like working with leaders and I encourage them, you're not on your own, because as you shared, we all struggle with difficult conversations in different circumstances or with different individuals. But the key here is to reach out to a trusted advisor, somebody I'd call an ally in my book, Cultivate, and run it past them. Do a quick role play. Yes. Just say, how might this, if they know the mutual person, how might they react if I put it in this context? And then that way you can refine the message before you go into the conversation.
I do a lot of role playing with my clients. And as a result, I'm like, no, I don't think that's quite the way you want to say it. And I'm from New York, and you were talking about, you have the English. I'm from New York, and we speak differently than the people on the West Coast. And when we're working with the people on the West Coast, we have to dial it down and speak in a different way. And so sometimes it's just, smoothing out the message.
So rounding out the corners. And I like the fact that you talked there about the role play. Goes back to, again, your childhood dream of being the actress, I suppose, and learning our lines. And often I've found that leaders, they'll try and plan for the whole conversation. And of course, that has its own challenges in of itself. What are your thoughts about planning 2 or 3 moves down the line?
Well, I do think it's good to have a plan, but it's also good to recognize that things might not go according to plan. And I also think a lot of the more difficult conversations are not just one and done. We may start out by starting, here and then pausing and saying, I know that's a lot to take in. Why don't we take a break and reconvene tomorrow?
Okay.
So sometimes we're so anxious. We just want to get through this. Let's get this over with. Like we just do like a dump and the person's just like, so we really, you have to watch those verbal cues, whether today we're having a lot of these difficult conversations online. And when you have to have one of those, that's why I encourage people to make sure that cameras are on. Mm-hmm. Because I can't see you. I don't know how you're reacting. I just hear like dead silence.
So what other tips do you have for leaders and individuals who might be giving feedback horizontally or to their co-workers for delivering difficult messages through the video camera? You talked there about having the camera on. What other best practices do you have for us?
Well, I think one of the best practices is if you are going to have a difficult conversation with someone, tell them up front, listen, I'd like to have a conversation with you. Is there a place where you can speak openly and in private? Because, in the office, that person's, son or daughter isn't walking in the room. Their spouse isn't sitting right there going, what? Mm-hmm. But now you have no idea if there's anyone else around here. And so you might say things that maybe I don't really want anyone else to hear. And so asking that question out of respect will set you up in a much stronger position to have this kind of conversation.
It's helping to deliver that message with compassion and, to your point, being thoughtful beyond the little 3x5 window that I can see and what might be happening off stage that may distract somebody and not allow them to focus. And of course, may have unintended
embarrassing. I mean, if I just told you, dude, we're gonna fire you, and your partner's sitting there going, like,
So we know that this book is number 6 in the series, and I can see some of the others at the back. So tell us a little bit more about the other books, because obviously once we read this one, we're going to be off and investigating the others. So tell us about the other books and the journey that you've been on.
Well, about a year and a half ago, I released a new book called Evergreen Talent, and that's all about how to, sow and cultivate a sustainable workforce. And that book came out a year ago in February, and it's very relevant today. And then I've written Talent Magnetism, which is, again, how to attract talent that will stick around. I wrote The Magnetic Leader, to help leaders become sticky so that people adhere to them. And then I wrote the book Suddenly in Charge, which is about managing up, managing down, succeeding all around.
I love that. So a full spectrum of how to be successful at work, whatever your leadership level, not just focused on the technical skills of what you might be doing.
Yes, exactly. And so I see this new book pairing really well with Suddenly in Charge, because if I were a new leader or a leader who's never really had a lot of coaching, I think that, knowing what to do and then knowing how to implement that, how to facilitate it. I use a lot of, I created a lot of sample conversations that people can use and adapt and create for their own needs. And so I see the two right now being very well married together.
So Suddenly in Charge and Can We Talk, the twofer that we all ought to be getting. And that's what I love about your books, is they are very pragmatic and accessible. They've got some real world examples, obviously from your HR experience and your consulting experience, but also tips and tricks, those conversations, not necessarily scripts to follow to the letter, but at least guides that help us to get started as we're thinking about the unique circumstances and challenges we're all facing.
Exactly.
So, Roberta, as we come to the end of our time together, tell me a little bit more and let our listeners know, how can they learn more, both about the books, but the work that you and your firm do?
They can go to my website at Matuson, Matuson, consulting.com. They can find out about the books there as well, or go on to Amazon or Porchlight or Barnes & Noble, wherever you like to buy your books. And then you can follow me on Twitter at Matuson. And you can send me an invite on LinkedIn and just mention this podcast so I know who you are. I get a lot of requests. I'd love to accept yours, and it helps if I know that you know me in some way.
Okay, well, you heard it here first. Quote people first when you reach out to Roberta. And Roberta, I wish you every success with your new book, Can We Talk? 7 Principles for Managing Difficult Conversations at Work. And of course, make sure you also get your hands on Suddenly in Charge, managing up, managing down, and succeeding all around. Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining Morag today. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe so you don't miss a thing. If you learned something worth sharing, share it. Cultivate your relationships today when you don't need anything before you need something. Be sure to follow SkyeTeam and Morag on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any ideas about topics we should tackle, interviews we should do, or if you yourself would like to be on the show, drop us a line at info@skyeteam.com. That's SKYE team.com. Thanks again for joining us today, and remember, business is personal and relationships matter. We are your allies.